What would you do if the person who destroyed your entire life became the only one standing between you and death? A young woman, cast out and condemned by lies she couldn't fight, crawls through muddy hills in a storm, pregnant, abandoned, with nothing but rage keeping her alive. She gives birth alone in the darkness, certain she'll die with her newborn in her arms. But someone is watching from the shadows, a man whose golden eyes hold secrets that could shatter kingdoms. A man who shouldn't be there, who has everything to lose by saving her, yet cannot walk away. When she discovers his true identity, the betrayal cuts deeper than any blade. Because he's not just any stranger. He's the one who signed her death sentence without ever looking at her face. The one whose cowardice stole everything she had. And now he's asking for something impossible, a chance to make things right. But in a world where crowns are built on lies and power feeds on the vulnerable, can truth ever be enough to heal wounds this deep? Or will the forces conspiring against them destroy not just their lives, but the fragile hope that redemption might actually be possible? Because someone followed the king into those hills, someone who saw everything. And what happens next will force them both to choose between love and survival, between justice and mercy, between the comfort of hate and the terrifying vulnerability of forgiveness. But the real question is, when the truth finally explodes in front of an entire kingdom, will either of them survive what comes after? The wind tore through the hills like a blade drawn across flesh, sharp and merciless, carrying with it the scent of wet earth and something else, something metallic, undeniable. Blood. A young woman crawled through the mud, her swollen belly dragging beneath her, fingers clawing at the slick ground as though she could anchor herself to something, anything, that wouldn't betray her. Rain lashed her face, mingling with tears that had nothing to do with physical pain. This was abandonment carved into her bones, a rejection so complete it felt like being skinned alive. The distant church bells from the castle rang out in mockery, each chime a reminder of where she'd stood just hours before, disgraced, accused, expelled like refuse. Her breath came in ragged gasps, each one scraping her throat raw. The contractions had started near the castle gates, but she'd refused to collapse there, refused to give them the satisfaction of watching her suffer on their pristine cobblestones. So she'd stumbled into the wilderness, into these godless hills where even the trees seemed to turn their backs. Between waves of agony, she whispered a name that burned her tongue. Alden. The word was both prayer and curse, love and hatred twisted into two syllables. She'd been warned never to speak it, never to let it cross her lips again. But here, alone with the storm and the gathering darkness, who could stop her? Her trembling hand pressed against her belly, feeling the life inside fighting to break free. This child, this impossible, unwanted, precious child, was her last act of defiance. The baby came with the thunder, as if the heavens themselves were screaming. No midwife's hands to guide the infant into the world, no warm linens or hushed words of encouragement. Just a woman whose body was being torn apart on cold stone and mud, her screams swallowed by the wind. She bit down on her own arm to muffle the sound, tasting copper and salt. The pain was beyond anything she'd imagined, a fire that consumed her from within, but she bore it with gritted teeth because surrender meant death, for both of them. When the child finally slipped free, the silence that followed was more terrifying than any sound. For 3 heartbeats, 4, 5, nothing. Then a wail, thin and defiant, pierced the storm. The woman's body went limp, but her face transformed. She smiled, not with hope or relief, but with something darker, more dangerous. Triumph. This life she'd carried, this tiny creature now screaming against the injustice of existence, was her revenge. They could take her home, her dignity, her name, but they couldn't take this. She gathered the slippery, blood-covered infant against her chest, using torn pieces of her own dress to wrap the fragile body. The baby's cries weakened to mewling whimpers, and panic seized her. Too cold. Everything was too cold. Her vision blurred at the edges, dark spots blooming like ink stains across her sight. She tried to stand, but her legs buckled, refusing to obey. The hills spun around her, and she realized with crystalline clarity that she was dying. This was how it would end, not with dignity, not with peace, but shivering in mud with her bastard child pressed against her failing heart. But she wasn't alone. Through the rain-soaked darkness, a figure emerged. At first she thought it was death itself come to claim her, cloaked and faceless. But as it drew closer, she saw eyes, golden in the storm's strange light, and wet with something that looked impossibly like tears. The figure stood motionless, watching, and in her delirium, she wondered if she'd conjured a ghost. The man's hood concealed most of his face, but she could see his jaw tightening, see the way his gloved hands clenched and unclenched at his sides, as though fighting some internal battle. How long had he been there? How much had he witnessed? The questions flickered through her fading consciousness, but she couldn't form words anymore. Her arms loosened around the baby, strength bleeding out of her like water from a cracked vessel. The stranger took a step forward, then another, his expensive boots, too fine for a commoner, too clean for a wanderer, squelching in the mud. She should have been afraid. She should have protected her child from this unknown presence. But as darkness claimed her vision, as her body finally surrendered to exhaustion and blood loss, she felt only a strange, terrible relief. The man knelt beside her, his hands gentle as he caught both mother and child before they could collapse fully into the filth. His face came close to hers, and even through the haze of unconsciousness, she registered something shocking. Recognition flickered in those golden eyes. Recognition and guilt so profound it seemed to age him before her. His lips moved, forming words she couldn't hear over the roar of blood in her ears, but she could read the shape of them. Forgive me. In that moment, though she couldn't know it, couldn't understand the full weight of what was happening, their fates became permanently intertwined. The man who had destroyed her was now the only thing standing between her and oblivion. And as he lifted her broken body into his arms, the baby still clutched against her chest. His tears finally fell, mixing with the rain, with the blood, with all the secrets that would soon tear a kingdom apart. King Alden's arms trembled as he carried the unconscious woman through the darkness. The infant pressed between them like a secret too dangerous to speak aloud. His royal cloak, heavy with rain and embroidered with golden thread that marked his station, dragged through the mud, a desecration that would have horrified his advisors. But they weren't here to see him now, weren't here to witness their sovereign stumbling through wilderness like a common thief fleeing judgment. The weight in his arms felt heavier than any crown, heavier than the armor he'd worn into battle as a younger man. This was the weight of culpability, of choices made in weakness and defended with lies. The abandoned shepherd's cabin appeared through the mist like an answer to a prayer he hadn't dared voice. Its thatched roof sagged in places, and the wooden door hung crooked on rusted hinges, but it offered shelter, and more importantly, secrecy. He kicked the door open with more force than necessary, the sound echoing his frustration, his self-loathing. Inside, the air smelled of old straw and mouse droppings, but it was dry. He laid the woman on a pile of musty blankets left behind by whoever had last sought refuge here, his hands lingering perhaps a moment too long before he pulled away. The baby whimpered, and he froze, staring at the tiny face with an expression caught between wonder and terror. Years. It had been years since he'd held an infant. Years since his own son had died of fever in the palace nursery while Alden had been away securing meaningless alliances with neighboring lords. His wife, Queen Marguerite, had never forgiven him for that absence, and perhaps rightly so. Their marriage had become a tomb after that, cold and silent, until her own death 2 winters past had finally released them both from the pretense of affection. Since then, the castle had been a prison of his own making, its halls echoing with the footsteps of counselors who spoke in honeyed tones while plotting their own advancement. He moved mechanically, years of military training overriding the chaos in his mind. Fire first. There was kindling in the corner, dry enough to catch. His hands, accustomed to signing death warrants and gripping sword hilts, fumbled with flint and steel until sparks finally caught. As flames began to lick at the wood, casting dancing shadows across the cabin's walls, he turned his attention back to the woman. Her dress was torn, soaked through with rain and blood and God knew what else. He found a relatively clean cloth among the abandoned supplies and began wiping the mud from her face with a gentleness that surprised him. That's when he saw it. The mark on her wrist, partially obscured by grime but unmistakable once revealed. A small brand, barely the size of a copper coin, burned into the flesh just below her palm. The royal household mark. His breath caught in his throat, and for a moment the cabin spun around him. This wasn't just any desperate woman seeking shelter. This was one of his own, or had been, until she'd been cast out. The memories came flooding back with nauseating clarity. 8 months ago, perhaps 9, time had a way of blurring when you spent your days avoiding your own reflection. There had been an accusation, a servant girl, young and quiet, one of the Queen's ladies-in-waiting. Adultery, they'd said, carrying on with a stable hand, or perhaps a visiting merchant. The stories had varied depending on who was telling them. Queen Marguerite had been livid, her sharp voice echoing through the throne room as she demanded immediate banishment. And Alden, weak and weary from yet another pointless border dispute, had simply nodded his approval. He'd barely looked at the girl's face during the proceedings, too focused on maintaining the fragile peace with his wife, too concerned with appearing strong and decisive before his court. But he remembered now. Remembered the way the girl had stood before him, her hands clasped so tightly her knuckles had gone white, her eyes fixed on the floor as accusation after accusation had been hurled at her like stones. She'd never defended herself, never named the supposed father, never begged for mercy. Just that terrible, dignified silence that had made something in his chest constrict uncomfortably. He'd told himself at the time that her silence was proof of guilt. Easier that way. Easier than admitting he'd been too cowardly to question his wife, to investigate, to do anything other than take the path of least resistance. And now, here she was, half dead in his arms, with a newborn infant that couldn't possibly belong to any stable hand or merchant. The timing was all wrong. 9 months ago would have been. He did the calculations in his head, his mathematician's mind, the one skill his tutors had managed to beat into him, working through the implications. 9 months ago, Queen Marguerite had still been alive, paranoid and possessive, watching every interaction between her husband and any woman under 40 with the intensity of a hawk spotting prey. The woman, Elara, he suddenly remembered her name with startling clarity, stirred slightly, a soft moan escaping her cracked lips. Alden jerked back as if burned, his heart hammering against his ribs like a caged bird desperate for escape. What was he doing? What madness had possessed him to follow her into the wilderness, to bring her here, to involve himself in this catastrophe? If anyone discovered them, if even a whisper of this reached the castle, the scandal would destroy what little remained of his authority. His advisors would use it as proof of weakness, perhaps even move to replace him with his cousin Edmund, who'd been circling the throne like a vulture since Marguerite's death. But as Elara's eyes fluttered open, confusion and fear warring in their depths, Alden found he couldn't move, couldn't speak, couldn't do anything but stare at her and recognize, with the force of a sword through his gut, that this woman might hold the answer to a question he'd been too afraid to ask. When she finally focused on him, really saw him for the first time, she recoiled so violently that her head cracked against the wooden wall behind her. "Who are you?" she whispered, her voice raw and broken, one arm instinctively curling around the infant still clutched to her chest. The lie came easily, too easily. "Just a traveler," Alden heard himself say, his voice rough and unfamiliar. "I found you on the hills. You and your child." The words tasted like ash on his tongue. But what else could he say? The truth would destroy them both. So he lied, and watched something in her eyes shift. Not quite trust, but perhaps the beginning of it, born from desperation and the absence of alternatives. And as he turned back to the fire, adding more wood with shaking hands, he felt something crack inside his chest. An old guilt, dormant for months, awakening like a beast stirring from hibernation. It opened its eyes, fixed its gaze on him, and began demanding a reckoning he wasn't sure he could survive. 3 days passed in the cabin like a fever dream, reality bending at the edges until Elara couldn't distinguish between waking and sleeping anymore. The mysterious traveler came and went like a ghost, appearing with firewood when the flames died low, arriving with goat's milk still warm from the udder. leaving bread wrapped in cloth that smelled faintly of rosemary and something else, something expensive that didn't belong in the hands of a common wanderer. She watched him through half-closed eyes, pretending sleep when he thought she wasn't looking, studying the way he moved with a grace that spoke of training, of privilege, of secrets kept behind carefully constructed walls. There was something wrong about him, though she couldn't name it precisely. The wrongness sat in her stomach like spoiled meat, making her nauseous every time he drew near. His hands were too soft for a traveler, unmarred by the calluses that should have covered his palms if he'd truly spent his life on the road. His boots, though mud-stained now, bore the telltale marks of royal cobblery. She'd seen enough of them in her time at the palace to recognize the distinctive stitching, the quality of leather that cost more than most families earned in a year. And his eyes. God, those eyes haunted her even when she slept, golden and weighted with a grief that seemed ancient, bottomless. The baby nursed fitfully at her breast, and Elara found herself singing without thinking, her voice cracked and wavering but carrying melodies she'd learned in the palace corridors. Old songs, the kind that ladies-in-waiting hummed while mending the queen's gowns or arranging flowers in the great hall. She didn't notice the way the traveler would pause mid-motion when she sang, his back going rigid, his breathing changing rhythm. Didn't see how his hands would clench into fists, knuckles white with tension, or how he'd sometimes press his forehead against the cabin wall as though trying to push through it into some other reality where none of this was happening. On the fourth morning, as weak sunlight filtered through gaps in the thatched roof, Elara gathered courage like kindling for a fire. "You never told me your name," she said, her voice stronger now, fed by rest and the stranger's provisions. He was crouched by the hearth, coaxing life back into the embers, and at her words his shoulders tensed in a way that made her breath catch. For a long moment he didn't answer, and she wondered if he'd heard her at all. Then, without turning, he spoke. "Does it matter?" The question hung in the smoky air between them, neither hostile nor kind, just weary beyond measure. "Names are just sounds we make to pretend we know each other." It was the kind of thing a philosopher might say, or a man who'd lost too much to believe in simple truths anymore. Elara felt a familiar anger spark in her chest, the same anger that had kept her alive through the humiliation in the palace courtyard, through the crawl into the hills, through the agony of birthing alone in the storm. "It matters to me," she said, and there was steel in her voice now, the steel that had been forged in betrayal and tempered in survival. "You know my face even if you don't know my name. You've seen me at my most vulnerable, half dead and bleeding. The least you can do is tell me who's playing savior to my damnation." The words came out harsher than she'd intended, but she didn't soften them. Couldn't afford to soften anything anymore. He turned then, finally, and the look on his face made her stomach twist. It was the expression of a man standing at the edge of a cliff, calculating whether the fall would kill him or just leave him broken enough to wish for death. "I'm nobody," he said, and the lie was so transparent it was almost insulting. Just someone who couldn't walk away. Before she could press further, he stood abruptly, reaching for his cloak. "I need to go. I'll be back before nightfall." The same pattern as always. Stay long enough to ensure she wouldn't die, then vanish for hours into whatever life he was hiding from her. But this time, Elara watched more carefully. Watched as he fastened his cloak with hands that trembled slightly. Watched as he paused at the door and glanced back at her with an expression that looked dangerously close to yearning. And after he left, after his footsteps faded into the morning mist, she rose on unsteady legs and began searching the cabin. Not for anything specific, just for answers to the questions that had been multiplying in her mind like weeds in an untended garden. She found it tucked in the corner where he'd been sleeping, partially hidden beneath a rolled blanket. A traveling cloak, finer than the one he wore daily, with embroidery along the hem that made her heart stop. Gold thread worked into the shape of a crowned lion, the royal seal. Her hand shook as she lifted the fabric, examining it in the dim light filtering through the cabin's single window. This wasn't some cast-off garment stolen from a laundry line. This was official court attire, the kind reserved for nobility, for advisors, for... The baby's cry shattered her thoughts, and she dropped the cloak as if it had burned her. Her mind raced, connecting pieces she'd been too exhausted, too traumatized to see before. The way he'd found her in the hills at precisely the right moment, as though he'd been following her. His intimate knowledge of where to find supplies, which paths to take. The grief in his eyes when he looked at her. A grief that spoke of personal guilt rather than stranger's pity. And most damningly, the way he'd reacted to her palace songs, like each note was a knife finding the gaps in his armor. She stumbled to the window, pressing her face against the grimy glass, and there, in the distance, barely visible through the morning fog, she saw him, saw the figure on horseback, the animal too well-bred to belong to a common traveler, its coat gleaming even through the mist. And as he reached up to adjust his hood, just for a moment, sunlight caught the ring on his finger. A simple band, nothing ostentatious, but she recognized it. Had seen it countless times from across throne rooms and great halls, had watched it tap against armrests while judgments were pronounced and fates decided. The royal signet ring. Her legs gave out and she slid down the wall. The baby clutched against her chest, her entire body shaking with a rage so pure it felt like ice in her veins. The traveler wasn't a traveler at all. The man who'd saved her, who'd tended her wounds and fed her child, who'd looked at her with those haunted golden eyes full of unspoken apologies, he was King Alden. The same man who'd sat silent on his throne while she was publicly destroyed, while his dead queen's accusations had stripped away her dignity like layers of skin. The same man who'd signed the order for her banishment without even meeting her eyes, too weak or too indifferent to question, to investigate, to show even a shred of mercy. And now he was here, playing the role of mysterious benefactor, as though kindness could erase what his cowardice had done. As though she could ever forgive the man who'd stolen her entire life with nothing more than a disinterested nod. The betrayal of it carved through her like a blade, and she found herself rocking back and forth, the baby's cries mixing with a sound she didn't recognize at first. Her own voice, raw and animal, keening out her grief and fury into the empty cabin. When he returned that evening, arms full of provisions, she was waiting. The baby slept peacefully in a makeshift cradle, but Elara stood by the fire, her posture rigid, her eyes burning with knowledge that couldn't be unlearned. "We need to talk," she said, and her voice was steady as stone, cold as the winter wind that had witnessed her giving birth alone in the mud. "And this time, Your Majesty, I want the truth." The ride back to the castle felt like a descent into hell, each hoofbeat echoing Elara's final words like a death knell. "I know who you are." 4 words that had shattered whatever fragile peace Alden had constructed in that cabin. Whatever fantasy he'd allowed himself that maybe, just maybe, he could make things right without facing the full weight of his sins. He'd tried to explain, tried to form sentences that might justify the unjustifiable, but she'd turned her back on him, shoulders shaking with either rage or tears or both, and told him to leave. So he'd left, like the coward he was, retreating to his throne and his crown and all the trappings of power that felt more like shackles with each passing day. The castle loomed before him in the pre-dawn darkness, its stone walls gray and imposing, windows like hollow eyes judging his return. He'd slipped out through the servants' passages 3 days ago, telling no one of his destination, leaving his advisors to assume he was brooding in his private chambers, as he'd done so often since Marguerite's death. But absence bred suspicion in places like this where every whisper could topple kingdoms and every secret became currency for those ambitious enough to spend it. Alden dismounted in the hidden stable reserved for royal discretion, the kind of place where kings arrived after visiting mistresses or conducting business too sordid for daylight. The stable master, an ancient man named Gareth who'd served 3 generations of monarchs, took the reins without comment, though his rheumy eyes lingered on the mud-staining Alden's cloak. The exhaustion carved into his face. "Rough journey, sire?" he asked, his tone carefully neutral. Alden managed a bitter laugh that sounded more like a cough. "You have no idea, old friend." Then, before he could stop himself, "Tell me, Gareth, if you made a terrible mistake, one that destroyed an innocent person's life, would confession make it better or worse?" The old man's weathered face creased with something that might have been sympathy. Depends on whether you're confessing to ease your own guilt or to actually make amends, I reckon. First one's just selfishness dressed up as honesty. The words hit Alden like a fist to the solar plexus, knocking the air from his lungs. He nodded once, unable to speak, and fled into the castle's bowels before his composure could crack completely. The royal archives were housed in the East Tower, accessible only through a series of locked doors that required keys Alden kept on a chain around his neck. He'd never spent much time here, preferring to let his scribes handle the tedious business of record-keeping, but now he moved through the cramped corridors lined with shelves like a man possessed. Somewhere in these thousands of documents lay the truth about Ilara's banishment, the evidence that had condemned her, the accusations that had seemed so credible at the time. It took him 2 hours of searching, his eyes burning from candlelight and dust, before he found the relevant ledgers. The household records from 9 months past, marked with Queen Marguerite's personal seal. He opened them with trembling hands, scanning entries that detailed every petty grievance and minor scandal of court life. There, a full page dedicated to the matter of the servant girl Ilara. Alden read through the accusations with growing horror, seeing for the first time the glaring inconsistencies he'd been too blind or too weak to notice before. The supposed witnesses were all members of Marguerite's inner circle, ladies-in-waiting who'd benefited greatly from the Queen's favor and would have said anything to maintain it. The evidence consisted of vague testimonies about seeing Ilara in compromising positions, but the dates didn't align, the locations contradicted each other, and nowhere, absolutely nowhere, was there any mention of the alleged father. It was a setup so obvious that a child could have seen through it, yet Alden had accepted it without question, because challenging it would have meant challenging his wife, and he'd learned long ago that Marguerite's wrath was something to be avoided at all costs. But why? Why had Marguerite targeted this particular girl with such venom? Alden flipped backward through the records, looking for earlier mentions of Ilara's name. There weren't many. She'd been a quiet servant, unremarkable in most ways, until he found an entry from 10 months past, a brief notation in the Queen's own handwriting. The king spoke kindly to the new girl today, watched her during the feast, must monitor this situation. Ice flooded Alden's veins. He tried to remember the feast in question, but the past year was a blur of formal dinners and meaningless celebrations. Had he noticed Ilara? Had he shown her some small kindness that Marguerite, paranoid and possessive even on her deathbed, had interpreted as something more? The possibility made him sick because if it was true, then Ilara had been destroyed not for any sin she'd committed, but simply for existing in a way that threatened the Queen's jealous vigilance. He continued searching, desperation making his movements frantic, and finally found what he was looking for tucked in a separate file marked Personal Correspondence. Letters between Marguerite and her chief lady-in-waiting, Lady Catherine, discussing the problem of the king's wandering attention. The language was coded, carefully ambiguous, but the intent was clear. Ilara had been chosen as a target, her reputation systematically destroyed through planted rumors and manufactured evidence, all to remind Alden who held the real power in their marriage. The magnitude of it staggered him. An innocent woman's entire life had been obliterated as a chess move in his dead wife's game of control. And he'd allowed it to happen, had been the very instrument of that destruction, his signature on the banishment order the final blow that sent Ilara into the wilderness. The baby she'd carried, the child she'd given birth to alone in the storm, whether it was his or some other man's didn't even matter anymore. What mattered was that she'd been pregnant when accused, that nobody had bothered to investigate that fact, that she'd been thrown away like garbage because it was easier than asking questions. Alden made his way to the throne room as dawn began to paint the stained glass windows in shades of blood and gold. The massive chair sat empty on its dais, velvet cushions meant to provide comfort but offering none. He climbed the steps slowly, feeling every one of his 43 years weighing on his bones, and sank onto the throne like a man collapsing under an impossible burden. The crown sat on a pedestal beside him, its jewels catching the morning light and throwing rainbows across the stone floor. Beautiful, meaningless. He picked it up, felt its weight in his hands, and for the first time in his life, seriously considered simply walking away from it all. But abdication wouldn't solve anything. wouldn't restore what Alara had lost, wouldn't erase the terror she must have felt crawling through those hills, wouldn't undo the fact that she'd looked at him with hatred in her eyes and been absolutely justified in doing so. The court would see abdication as weakness, would tear apart whoever succeeded him, would likely turn their predatory attention to Alara and the baby as loose ends requiring elimination. No, running wasn't the answer, but neither was staying if staying meant continuing to be the kind of king who destroyed innocent lives through cowardice and willful blindness. Footsteps echoed through the hall, and Alden looked up to see his chief advisor, Lord Edmund, his cousin, his rival, his necessary evil, approaching with a smile that never quite reached his eyes. "Your Majesty, we were concerned when you didn't attend the council meeting yesterday, or the day before." The implied question hung in the air, wrapped in false concern. Alden forced himself to meet Edmund's gaze, seeing the calculation there, the ambition barely masked by family loyalty. "I was attending to personal matters," Alden said, his voice flat and offering no opening for further inquiry. But Edmund wasn't so easily discouraged. He climbed the dais uninvited, his movements casual but his attention sharp as a hunting dog's. Personal matters that required 3 days away from the castle? In these uncertain times when the Northern Lords are already questioning your authority? The threat was subtle but unmistakable. "Step out of line, and I'll use it against you." Alden set the crown back on its pedestal with exaggerated care, buying himself time to think. The Northern Lords can wait. Some things are more important than politics. Edmund's eyebrows rose fractionally, surprise bleeding through his practiced composure. "More important than the kingdom? Your Majesty, I'm not sure I understand." And there it was, the opening gambit in whatever game Edmund was playing. Alden stood, drawing himself to his full height, and let a hint of the royal steel his father had tried to beat into him color his voice. "No, Edmund, you don't understand, and pray that you never do." He descended the dais, brushing past his cousin with deliberate dismissal, leaving the throne room and its weight of expectation behind. He had work to do, truths to uncover, and a wrong so massive he wasn't sure it could ever be made right. But he had to try. Because the alternative, continuing to be the man who'd signed that banishment order without a second thought, was no longer something he could live with. Alden returned to the cabin 4 days later, his saddlebags heavy with supplies and his heart heavier still with the weight of what he'd discovered. The morning mist clung to the hills like guilt made visible, wrapping everything in gray uncertainty. He'd rehearsed a dozen different speeches during the ride, practiced confessions and apologies until the words lost all meaning. But as he approached the weathered door, every carefully constructed phrase evaporated from his mind. Through the single window, he could see Alara moving inside, the baby cradled against her shoulder, and the sight of her, alive, standing, caring for the child despite everything, made something crack open in his chest. She must have heard his horse because when he pushed open the door, she was already facing him. The baby, wrapped now in clean linen he'd brought days before, rested in her arms, tiny fists clenching and unclenching with that purposeless intensity of newborns. But Alara's eyes were anything but purposeless. They tracked him with the focused attention of a predator watching prey, calculating distances, measuring threats. "You came back," she said, and the flatness in her voice was somehow worse than anger would have been. "I wasn't sure you would. Easier to abandon people from a distance, isn't it? Less messy than watching them suffer up close." The accusation hit its mark with surgical precision. Alden closed the door behind him, buying time, and set down the supplies with hands that wanted to shake, but refused to betray him further. "Alara, But she cut him off with a sharp gesture, the baby stirring slightly at the motion. Don't you dare say my name like you have the right to speak it." Her voice remained controlled, but underneath he could hear the tremor of rage held back by sheer force of will. "You sat on that throne and let them destroy me. Let your wife's poison drip into every ear in that palace until my name became synonymous with whore, with traitor, with everything vile and shameful. And you did nothing." She took a step forward, and Alden found himself taking a step back, this woman half his size, and weakened by childbirth, somehow more intimidating than any enemy he'd faced on battlefields. I stood in that courtyard while they stripped away my dignity piece by piece, while they called me things that made even the guards look away in embarrassment. And you know what the worst part was? Her eyes glittered with unshed tears that she refused to let fall. I kept waiting for you to stop it. Kept thinking, surely he'll ask questions. Surely he'll demand proof. Surely he'll at least look at my face and see that I'm telling the truth. But you never even looked up from your throne. The memory of that day came rushing back, and Alden wanted to argue, to defend himself. But the defense died unspoken because she was absolutely right. He'd been so focused on placating Marguerite, on maintaining the fragile peace of his failing marriage, that he'd treated Alara like a problem to be solved, rather than a person whose life hung in the balance. I know, he said finally, his voice rough. I know what I did, what I failed to do. Do you? Alara's laugh was sharp and brittle, a sound like glass breaking. Do you know what it's like to be pregnant and terrified, banished from the only home you've ever known, with no money, no family, nowhere to go? Do you know what it's like to give birth alone in the mud because the king you served faithfully couldn't be bothered to question his wife's jealous paranoia? The baby began to cry, responding to the tension in her mother's voice, and Alara automatically began swaying, soothing the infant even while her fury remained focused on Alden like a blade. He forced himself to hold her gaze, to not look away like he'd done that day in the courtyard. No, I don't know. I can't know. But I've spent the last 4 days in the archives, Alara. I found the records, the correspondence between Marguerite and her ladies. I know now that you were innocent, that the whole thing was fabricated because my wife saw you as a threat to her control over me. He pulled the copied documents from his saddlebag, held them out to her like an offering. I have proof. Proof that could clear your name, restore your position, clear my name. Alara's voice rose for the first time, startling the baby into louder wails. She clutched the child tighter, her whole body shaking now. You think documents can give me back what you took? My reputation is ashes. My honor is gone. I gave birth in a storm with nobody but the wind to witness it because of you. And you think proof matters now? She turned away, rocking the baby with increasing desperation as the infant's cries filled the small cabin. Get out. Get out and take your guilt and your proof and your crown and leave us alone. But Alden didn't move. Couldn't move. Because in that moment, watching Alara try to comfort the crying baby while her own tears finally broke free and streamed down her face, he understood something that made his carefully planned apologies seem hollow and insufficient. The child, he said quietly. Is it mine? The question hung in the air like smoke, impossible to ignore and equally impossible to clear away. Alara went very still, her back to him, and for a long moment the only sound was the baby's weakening cries as exhaustion began to claim the tiny body. When she finally spoke, her voice was barely a whisper. Does it matter? Yes. The word came out more forcefully than he'd intended, and Alden took a step forward, then another, until he was close enough to see the tension in her shoulders, the way her hands trembled as they held the infant. Yes, it matters. Not because of succession or legitimacy or any political calculation. It matters because if that child is mine, then I've committed an even greater crime than I thought. I've abandoned my own blood along with the woman who... He stopped, the words catching in his throat like fishhooks. Alara turned then, slowly, and the look on her face was devastating in its complexity. Pain and defiance and something that might have been longing if circumstances had been different. The woman who what, Alden? The woman you loved. You didn't love me. You barely knew I existed until your wife decided I was a threat. I was furniture to you, scenery, something you might have glanced at once or twice and then forgotten. The baby had quieted in her arms, eyes closing as sleep finally claimed consciousness, oblivious to the storm raging around its tiny existence. You're wrong. Alden's voice cracked on the words, and he didn't care anymore about maintaining composure or royal dignity or any of the masks he'd worn for so long they'd fused to his skin. I noticed you, Alara. God help me, I noticed you every time you entered a room, every time your voice joined the other servants singing in the halls. I noticed, and that noticing terrified me because Marguerite saw everything, controlled everything, and I was too weak to stand up to her. So I pretended not to see you, pretended that looking at you didn't make me feel things I hadn't felt in years. And when she accused you, I convinced myself it was easier to believe her lies than to face the truth, that I'd failed you long before that moment in the courtyard. The confession poured out of him like poison from a lanced wound, ugly and necessary. Alara stared at him with eyes that had gone wide with shock, her mouth slightly open as though she'd forgotten how to form words. The baby slept peacefully between them, tiny chest rising and falling with oblivious innocence, while the two adults faced each other across a chasm of betrayal and regret, so deep it seemed impossible to bridge. "I can't give you back what you lost," Alden continued, his voice steadier now, resolved. "Can't erase the humiliation or the pain or the fear you felt in those hills. But I can protect you and this child, whether it's mine or not. I can make sure you're safe, that you have resources, that nobody can hurt you again." He paused, then added quietly, "And I can spend whatever time I have left trying to become the man who deserved your trust in the first place, even if I never actually earn it." Alara's tears fell freely now, tracking down her cheeks and dripping onto the baby's swaddled form. "You want to know if this child is yours?" Her voice was raw, scraped clean of all pretense. "The truth is, I don't know. I've never been with anyone, Alden. Never. But you were in my dreams every night, and maybe that's enough to make a child. Or maybe I'm going mad. Or maybe—" She broke off, sobbing now, her careful control finally shattering completely. Alden moved without thinking, closing the distance between them and wrapping his arms around both woman and child, holding them as carefully as one might hold something infinitely precious and irreparably broken. Alara didn't pull away, too exhausted by emotion to fight anymore, and for a moment they stood there in the dim cabin, while outside the mist began to lift and somewhere far away, the castle bells rang out the hour. But before either could speak again, before anything could be resolved or forgiven or understood, the sound of horses reached them through the cabin walls, multiple horses, moving fast, accompanied by the jangle of armor and weapons. Alden's blood turned to ice. He pulled back from Alara, already reaching for the sword he'd strapped to his saddle. "They followed me," he said, and the horror in his voice was absolute. "God help us, they followed me here." Through the window he could see them now, palace guards wearing his cousin Edmund's colors, at least a dozen men surrounding the cabin with practiced efficiency. And at their head, sitting tall in his saddle with a smile that promised nothing good, was Edmund himself, watching the cabin door like a cat watching a mouse hole. The baby woke and began to cry again, as though sensing the danger that had just descended on their fragile sanctuary. Alara clutched the infant to her chest, her eyes meeting Alden's with a mixture of terror and accusation that cut deeper than any blade. "What have you done?" she whispered. And Alden, staring at the armed men outside, at his cousin's calculating expression, at the trap he'd walked them both into through his own foolish hope for redemption, had no answer that wouldn't sound like just another betrayal. The guards took Alara without gentleness, their iron grips bruising her arms as they dragged her from the cabin while she clutched the screaming baby against her chest. Alden had tried to intervene, had actually drawn his sword and commanded them to stand down, but Edmund had simply smiled that serpent smile and reminded him, in front of everyone, that a king who abandons his duties for days to cavort in the wilderness with disgraced servants has forfeited his right to give orders. The words had hit like a physical blow, and in the moment of Alden's hesitation, the guards had surrounded him, disarmed him, and bundled them all onto horses for the ride back to the castle. Now, 3 days later, Alara stood in chains before the assembled court, the great hall packed with nobles and merchants and common folk who'd heard whispers of scandal and come hungry for spectacle. The baby had been taken from her arms the moment they'd arrived at the castle, given to a wet nurse, they'd said, though Alara's breasts ached with milk and her heart ached worse with the absence of that small weight against her body. She'd screamed herself hoarse that first night in the dungeons, demanding her child back, until her voice had simply given out and left her with nothing but silent tears and rage that burned like acid in her veins. The throne sat empty on its dais, a pointed absence that sent murmurs rippling through the crowd. Edmund stood beside it instead, one hand resting possessively on the armrest, playing the role of concerned regent with practiced ease. "We gather today," he announced, his voice carrying effortlessly through the vaulted space, "to address a matter of utmost gravity. A woman, previously banished for adultery and moral corruption, has returned to our lands. Worse still, she has ensnared our beloved king, a man still grieving his late queen, in a web of manipulation and deceit." The crowd's murmurs grew louder, a mixture of shock and righteous indignation that made Alara want to vomit. She forced herself to stand straight despite the weight of the chains, despite the exhaustion that made her bones feel hollow. Her eyes scanned the assembled faces, looking for Alden, and finally found him standing among his own guards like a prisoner in all but name. His face was carved from stone, expressionless, but his hands were clenched so tightly at his sides that even from this distance she could see the white of his knuckles. Their eyes met for a fraction of a second, and in that brief connection she saw everything he couldn't say aloud: apology, desperation, fury at his own impotence. Edmund continued his performance, pacing before the throne like a prosecutor building his case. "The question before us is simple. Who fathered this woman's bastard child? She was accused of adultery before her banishment, yet refused to name the father then, and refuses still. Such silence suggests shame, does it not? Suggests guilt that goes deeper than mere moral weakness." He paused, letting the implication sink in, watching as understanding dawned on various faces throughout the hall. Some might wonder if perhaps the father is someone whose name would cause scandal, someone of high position, someone who should know better. The trap was masterful in its subtlety. Edmund wasn't directly accusing Alden. That would be too obvious, too crude. Instead, he was planting seeds, letting the court draw its own conclusions, building a narrative that would justify whatever power grab he had planned. Alara felt her stomach twist with understanding. This wasn't really about her at all. She was just a convenient weapon being wielded in a much larger game. Her life and her child's life, nothing more than pieces on Edmund's political chessboard. "Speak, woman." Edmund's voice cracked like a whip, startling her from her thoughts. "Tell this assembly the name of your child's father, and perhaps we can show mercy. Continue your stubborn silence, and we'll have no choice but to assume the worst, that you seek to claim royal blood for your bastard, to worm your way back into palace life through lies and seduction." The accusation hung in the air, absurd and yet somehow gaining credibility through sheer repetition. Alara's throat was dry, her voice still rough from days of screaming and crying, but she forced words out anyway. "I have nothing to confess because I've committed no crime. The accusations against me were false then and remain false now. My child's father." She stopped, the words catching, because what could she say? That she didn't know? That she'd never lain with any man but somehow carried a child anyway? That the king himself had confessed to noticing her, to feeling things he shouldn't have felt, but that nothing had ever actually happened between them? Any answer would sound like either madness or manipulation. The silence stretched, heavy and suffocating, until it became its own form of testimony. Edmund seized on it immediately, turning to address the crowd with theatrical concern. "You see? She cannot answer because the truth would destroy her carefully constructed fiction. My lords and ladies, I propose that this woman be exiled permanently, her child placed in the care of the church where it might be raised without the stain of its mother's shame. And as for our king," he turned toward Alden now, his expression perfectly calibrated to suggest reluctant duty, "perhaps it's time we discussed whether a man so easily led astray by a common servant girl possesses the judgment necessary to rule." The words were treason, barely disguised, and the entire hall seemed to inhale collectively. Alden moved then, finally, pushing past the guards who'd been shadowing him and striding forward with a fury that made people stumble back. "You go too far, cousin." His voice was quiet, but it cut through the noise like a blade, silencing even the most persistent whispers. "You speak of judgment while staging this circus, of truth while dealing in insinuation and slander. If you have accusations against me, make them directly. Otherwise, hold your tongue before I have it removed." Edmund didn't flinch, didn't show even a flicker of intimidation. Accusations, Your Majesty. I make no accusations. I simply observe what everyone can see, that you abandoned your duties, your court, your kingdom, to pursue this woman into the wilderness. That you were found with her in circumstances that suggest impropriety. That you seem willing to destroy your own reputation, and by extension the stability of the realm, for reasons you refuse to explain. He spread his hands in a gesture of false helplessness. If there's an innocent explanation, by all means, share it. Otherwise, the council has no choice but to question your fitness to rule. Alara watched the exchange with growing horror, understanding finally crystallizing into terrible clarity. This had been Edmund's plan from the beginning. Follow Alden, catch him in a compromising situation, use it to undermine his authority and seize power. She was just collateral damage, her life and her child's life worth nothing against the prize of a throne. And Alden, trapped between truth and lies, between protecting her and protecting his kingdom, stood paralyzed by the impossible choice Edmund had engineered. The baby's cry suddenly pierced the tension, echoing from somewhere beyond the great hall's doors. The wet nurse must have brought the infant closer, perhaps on Edmund's orders, timed perfectly to maximize the emotional impact of the moment. Alara's entire body responded to that sound, milk letting down painfully, arms aching with emptiness, every maternal instinct screaming at her to go to her child. She took a step forward without thinking, chains rattling, and immediately guards moved to restrain her. But then something extraordinary happened. The cry continued, growing louder, more insistent, and the great hall's doors opened to admit the wet nurse carrying the squalling infant. The woman looked apologetic, overwhelmed, as she tried to soothe the baby without success. "Forgive me, my lords, but the child won't stop crying, won't take the breast, won't be calmed. I thought perhaps—" She trailed off, uncertain, looking between Edmund and the chained woman before her. Alden moved before anyone could stop him, crossing the space between himself and the wet nurse in 3 long strides. He looked down at the crying infant, and something in his face cracked open, all that careful stone composure shattering into raw emotion. "Give the child to its mother," he said, his voice hoarse. Edmund started to protest, but Alden rounded on him with such fury that his cousin actually took a step back. "I said give the child to its mother, now." The wet nurse hurried forward, placing the baby in Alara's chained arms with trembling hands. The infant's cries subsided immediately, tiny fists clutching at her dress, seeking the comfort of familiar heartbeat and scent. Alara bent her head over her child, tears falling onto the small wrinkled face, and in that moment nothing else mattered. Not the court, not the chains, not even the fate hanging over them both. Alden turned to face the assembled nobility, his jaw set, and when he spoke, every word fell like a hammer blow. That cry, his voice broke and he didn't try to hide it. That cry is the sound of my guilt, my failure, my cowardice made manifest. The hall erupted in shocked murmurs, but Alden raised his hand for silence, and somehow, impossibly, they obeyed. I don't know if that child is mine by blood, but I know that woman is innocent of every accusation ever leveled against her. I know because I've seen the proof, because I've read the correspondence that shows how my late wife manufactured evidence to destroy an innocent girl. And I know that whether I fathered that child or not, I am responsible for everything Alara has suffered. The confession hung in the air like smoke from a funeral pyre, impossible to ignore and equally impossible to take back. Edmund's face had gone purple with rage, but before he could speak, Alden continued. "You want to question my fitness to rule, cousin? You're right to question it. A man who lets innocence be destroyed through his own weakness, who values political convenience over justice, who sits silent while lies destroy lives, that man has no business wearing a crown." He reached up and removed the golden circlet from his head, holding it in both hands as though weighing its worth against the souls it had cost. "So here's my judgment on myself. I am unfit, I am guilty, and I will spend whatever time I have left making amends, even if those amends can never be enough." The great hall descended into chaos. Nobles shouted over each other, some demanding Alden's immediate removal from the throne, others calling for order, a few brave voices rising in defense of their king's honesty. Edmund stood frozen, his carefully orchestrated coup crumbling before his eyes as the very confession he'd hoped to extract turned into something he couldn't control. A king admitting fault, accepting responsibility, choosing justice over self-preservation. It was unprecedented, dangerous, and worst of all for Edmund's purposes, it was making Alden look more kingly than he had in years. Alden held up the crown, and gradually the cacophony subsided into tense silence. His hands trembled as he placed the golden circlet not back on his own head, but on the throne itself, leaving it there like an abandoned child. "I will not hide behind my position anymore," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the hall. "I failed Alara when I should have protected her. I failed my kingdom when I chose comfort over truth. And if my confession brings scandal, if it weakens the crown's authority, then so be it. Better a weak king who speaks truth than a strong one built on lies." He turned to face Alara directly, and the naked vulnerability in his expression made several people in the crowd gasp. "I cannot give you back what was taken, cannot undo the humiliation, the pain, the terror you felt giving birth alone in those hills. But I can offer you something I should have offered months ago, belief. I believe you. I believe in your innocence, and I will make sure everyone in this kingdom knows that you were wronged by my cowardice and my late wife's jealousy." His voice cracked on the words, tears tracking down his face without shame. "I'm sorry, Alara. I'm so desperately sorry." The apology hung in the air like a prayer, witnessed by hundreds of eyes, impossible to unsay or retract. Alara stood with the baby clutched to her chest, her own tears flowing freely, and for a long moment she couldn't speak at all. The weight of his confession pressed against something inside her that had been calcified by suffering, that had hardened into protective armor against further hurt. But now that armor was cracking, splitting open, and underneath was something raw and bleeding and terrifyingly alive. "You think words fix this?" Her voice came out hoarse, barely above a whisper, yet somehow everyone heard it. "You think a public apology gives me back my life, my reputation, the 9 months I spent terrified and alone, wondering if I'd die in childbirth with no one to even bury my body?" The baby stirred against her, responding to the emotion in her voice, and she automatically began swaying, soothing even while her fury poured out. "You destroyed me, Alden. Not with your own hands, maybe, but you signed the order. You sat silent while they called me things that made me want to die. You were too weak to question, too cowardly to investigate, too comfortable on that throne to risk anything for a servant girl you barely knew." Each accusation landed like a physical blow, and Alden absorbed them without defense, his face pale but his eyes never leaving hers. "You're right," he said simply. "About all of it. I was weak, cowardly, comfortable. I chose the easy path and you paid the price. There's no forgiveness large enough to cover what I did, no apology sufficient to make it right." He paused, swallowing hard. "But I'm offering what I can. Your name cleared publicly. Resources to rebuild your life wherever you choose to go. Protection for you and your child, legally documented, that no one can challenge. And my promise that I will never stop trying to be the man who deserved your trust in the first place, even though I know I never will be." The crowd murmured, some moved by the king's contrition, others scandalized by the entire spectacle. Edmund seized the moment, his voice cutting through the emotional tension like a knife. "This is madness. Your Majesty, you speak of clearing this woman's name, but on what grounds? Your feelings? Your guilt? The law requires evidence, not sentiment. And even if she was falsely accused of adultery, what of the present situation? You were found with her in that cabin alone, in circumstances that speak for themselves. How do you explain that without admitting to the very impropriety you claim never occurred?" It was a masterful pivot, turning Alden's confession against him, and several nobles nodded in agreement. The king had admitted to failing Alara, but he hadn't explained what his relationship with her actually was, leaving a void that people's imaginations were already filling with increasingly lurid scenarios. Alden opened his mouth to respond, but before he could speak, Alara's voice cut through the tension. There was no impropriety. The words came out strong, clear, ringing with a truth that made even Edmund pause. "The king found me dying in those hills and showed mercy. Nothing more, nothing less. He brought me to shelter, provided food and care, and revealed his identity only when I discovered it myself. Whatever guilt he carries is for the past, not for any sin committed in that cabin. She met Edmund's eyes directly, refusing to be cowed. You want scandal, Lord Edmund. You want to use me as a weapon to take what isn't yours. But I won't be your tool. I won't let my suffering become your ladder to power. The accusation was bold, dangerous, and absolutely accurate. Edmund's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, an elderly voice spoke from the back of the hall. The girl speaks truth. Every head turned to see Father Benedict, the kingdom's oldest and most respected priest, making his way slowly through the crowd. He'd served 3 generations of monarchs, baptized Alden himself, and his word carried weight that transcended politics. I have examined the records His Majesty discovered, the old priest continued, his voice thin but steady. The accusations against this woman were fabricated, built on testimony from witnesses who have since admitted, under the seal of confession, that they were coerced by the late queen. There is no evidence of adultery, no proof of moral corruption, nothing but jealousy and political maneuvering disguised as justice. He reached the front of the hall, his rheumy eyes sweeping over the assembled nobility. A wrong was done here, a grievous wrong that this court is obligated to correct. The impact of his words rippled through the crowd like stones thrown into still water. Edmund's carefully constructed narrative was collapsing, his political calculation undermined by the one voice in the kingdom that couldn't be dismissed as partisan or self-serving. He tried to rally, opening his mouth to argue, but Father Benedict raised a weathered hand to silence him. As for the king's fitness to rule, the priest continued, I would argue that a man who admits his failures shows more strength than one who hides behind excuses. King Alden has done what few monarchs in history have had the courage to do. Acknowledged his mistakes publicly and committed to making amends. That is not weakness, Lord Edmund. That is leadership of the highest order. The old man turned to face Alden directly. Though I would counsel your majesty that grand gestures mean little without concrete action. Words must be followed by deeds, or they become nothing but noise. Alden nodded, accepting the gentle rebuke. He turned back to Alara, and when he spoke, his voice was steady with purpose. Then let my first deed be this. Alara, you are hereby pardoned for all charges ever brought against you. Your name is cleared, your honor restored, and you are free to go wherever you choose. The castle treasury will provide funds sufficient to establish yourself in any city or village you prefer. And your child, regardless of paternity, will be under royal protection. Anyone who threatens or harms either of you will answer to me personally. He paused, then added more quietly, I'm not asking you to forgive me, not asking you to stay, or to give me a chance I don't deserve. I'm just asking you to take what you need and build the life that should never have been stolen from you. The chains on Alara's wrists suddenly felt impossibly heavy, a weight she'd almost grown accustomed to, but now couldn't bear another moment. She looked down at her baby, sleeping now, oblivious to the drama surrounding its tiny existence, and felt something shift inside her chest. I can't forgive you, she said finally, and the honesty in her voice was somehow kinder than false absolution would have been. Not yet, maybe not ever. What you did, what you allowed to happen, it broke something in me that I don't know how to fix. Alden nodded, pain flickering across his face, but acceptance there too. But, Alara continued, her voice softening slightly, I believe you're sorry. I believe you'll try to do better. And maybe that's enough for now. She shifted the baby in her arms, meeting his eyes with an expression that held both sorrow and something that might eventually become the seed of forgiveness. Truth gave me back my dignity. Now I need time to figure out what to do with it. A guard stepped forward to remove her chains, the metal falling away with a sound like absolution, and for the first time in 9 months, Alara stood free before the court that had condemned her. The great hall remained silent, hundreds of witnesses to a moment that would be retold and debated for generations. And as Alara turned to leave, her baby cradled against her heart, Alden remained standing before the empty throne. A king without his crown, powerful and powerless all at once, watching the woman he'd failed walk away toward a future he could no longer dictate or control. 7 years had passed since the day Alara walked out of the great hall with her child in her arms and her chains left behind on the cold stone floor. 7 years of seasons turning, of wounds slowly scarring over, of a life rebuilt from ash and determination. The hills where she'd given birth, those same brutal slopes that had witnessed her darkest moment, had become her sanctuary, her home, her place of quiet redemption. The stone cottage she'd built with her own hands stood modest but solid against the landscape, its walls thick enough to keep out winter's bite, and its garden abundant enough to feed both her and the boy. Thomas, she'd named him, not after any king or noble, but after her father, a simple carpenter who died when she was young, but whose gentle hands she still remembered. The boy had grown tall for his age, with golden eyes that sometimes caught the light in ways that made travelers pause and stare, though they never quite understood why. On this particular morning, mist clung to the valleys like spirits reluctant to leave the earth, and Alara stood at her window watching the sunrise paint the world in shades of amber and rose. Thomas was still asleep in the small bedroom they'd carved out of the cottage's back corner, his breathing the steady rhythm of childhood innocence. She'd protected that innocence fiercely over the years, building a life simple enough that he'd never have to know about thrones or scandals or the complicated legacy written into his very bones. Movement caught her eye, a figure walking up the hill path that led to her cottage. Not unusual. People from the village sometimes came seeking the healing herbs she'd learned to cultivate, or asking her to teach their daughters to read, skills she'd acquired during her brief time in the palace that had proven unexpectedly valuable in this simpler life. But there was something in the way this figure moved, a deliberateness that made her heart skip uncomfortably. As the shape drew closer, emerging from the mist like a memory taking form, she recognized the gray in his hair, the slight stoop to shoulders that had once been held militarily straight. Alden looked older than 7 years should have made him. The lines around his eyes had deepened into crevasses, and his clothes, well-made but simple, traveler's garb rather than royal finery, hung on a frame that had lost some of its substance, as though grief had been slowly consuming him from within. He carried wildflowers in one hand, the kind that grew along the hill paths, and there was something achingly humble about the gesture that made Alara's throat tighten. She didn't go out to meet him. Instead, she watched as he approached the cottage, paused at the small wooden gate she'd built to keep Thomas's rescued goat from wandering, and stood there as though gathering courage. He came every few months, she knew. Had been coming since the year after her departure from the castle, though he never knocked on her door, never demanded entry or audience. He would simply leave things, sometimes food from the castle kitchens, sometimes gold coins that she initially refused to touch but eventually accepted for Thomas's sake. Sometimes letters she'd never opened but kept in a box beneath her bed like prayers from a god she wasn't sure she believed in anymore. This time, though, something was different. She could see it in the set of his jaw, the way his hand trembled slightly as he laid the flowers at her gate. He stood there for a long moment, and Alara found herself opening the door before she'd consciously decided to, stepping out into the morning air that smelled of dew and distant wood smoke. "You came," she said, and her voice was steadier than she'd expected, neutral ground between welcome and dismissal. Alden's head snapped up, surprise flickering across his features before settling into something that looked like relief mixed with terror. "I didn't think you'd—" He stopped, swallowed, started again. "I didn't mean to intrude, I just wanted to—" He gestured helplessly at the flowers, at the cottage, at everything and nothing. "You've been leaving gifts for 7 years. Alara said, folding her arms across her chest not defensively, but as a way to hold herself together. Never once knocked. Never asked to see him. The unspoken question hung between them. Why now? What had changed? Alden's laugh was bitter and self-deprecating. "I didn't think I had the right. Still don't, truthfully. But I'm leaving soon. Going north to the monasteries, to spend whatever years I have left doing something useful. Edmund rules now, officially with the council's blessing. I abdicated 6 months ago." He said it casually, as though giving up a kingdom was no more significant than changing clothes, But Alara could see the cost of that decision etched into every line of his face. Why? The question escaped before she could stop it, and Alden's smile was sad and knowing. Because I meant what I said in that throne room, about becoming someone who deserved trust. Can't do that while wearing a crown built on compromises and political calculations. Can't heal a kingdom while still wounded myself. He paused, his eyes drifting to the cottage windows as though hoping to catch a glimpse of something. Someone he'd never claimed. I wanted to see him before I left. Just once. Just to know he's real. That something good came from all that suffering. Alara felt her carefully constructed walls trembling, threatening to crumble. 7 years of keeping distance, of building a life separate from the palace and its ghosts. And here was Alden asking for the one thing she'd sworn he'd never have. Access to the child whose paternity remained uncertain, whose existence had become her entire world. He doesn't know, she said quietly. Doesn't know about you, about the palace, about any of it. He thinks his father was a kind traveler who died before he was born. It's easier that way. Cleaner. I know. Alden's voice was gentle, understanding in a way that made it worse somehow. I'm not asking to tell him. Not asking for anything except maybe 5 minutes. To see his face, hear his voice. To know that he's happy and safe and loved, which is more than I ever gave you. He took a step forward, then stopped himself, respecting the invisible boundary between them. Then I'll go, and you'll never have to see me again. I promise. From inside the cottage, a child's voice called out, sleep-roughed and querulous. Mama, I heard voices. Alara turned, her heart clenching, and saw Thomas standing in the doorway in his nightshirt. His golden eyes, so like Alden's it was almost painful, blinking against the morning light. The boy looked at the stranger at their gate with curiosity rather than fear, the way children do when they've been raised in safety and don't yet understand that the world can hurt them. Just a visitor, sweetheart, Alara said, her voice catching slightly. Why don't you go get dressed? We're helping old Martha with her garden today, remember? Thomas nodded and disappeared back inside, and in his absence the silence felt like a cathedral, vast and holy and unbearably sad. Alden stood frozen, his face working through emotions too complex to name, and when he finally spoke, his voice was wrecked with feeling. He has her eyes, Marguerite's eyes, my eyes. It wasn't quite a question, but Alara answered anyway with a nod that felt like absolution or condemnation or maybe both. Does that... Alden stopped, cleared his throat. Does knowing for certain change anything for you? Alara considered the question, really considered it, looking at this man who'd destroyed and saved her in equal measure, who'd spent 7 years trying to earn forgiveness without ever asking for it directly. No, she said finally, and it was true. He's mine, Alden. Whatever blood runs in his veins, whatever legacy he might have claimed in another life, he's mine. I gave birth to him alone. I've raised him alone. I've made him who he is, and who he'll become has nothing to do with crowns or thrones or the mistakes people made before he was born. She paused, then added more softly, but I'm not sorry, you know. Not sorry you got to see him, even just for a moment. Alden's tears fell freely now, tracking down his weathered face and disappearing into his beard. Thank you, he whispered. For him. For the life you've given him. For being strong enough to survive what I put you through and still find it in yourself to be kind. He picked up the flowers from where he'd laid them, held them out to her like an offering at an altar. I don't expect forgiveness, Alara, but I hope you know that watching you rebuild, seeing that cottage standing strong on those hills where you nearly died, it's been the only thing keeping me sane these years. Proof that some good can come from ashes, that redemption is possible even when it doesn't include being redeemed. Alara took the flowers, their stems damp with dew or tears or both, and allowed herself to really look at Alden for the first time in 7 years. Saw not the king who'd failed her, not the coward on the throne, but just a man who'd spent nearly a decade trying to become someone better and would probably spend the rest of his life trying still. Truth gave me back my dignity, she said, echoing words from that throne room that felt like a lifetime ago. But time gave me something else. Perspective, maybe. Or just exhaustion from carrying hate around like baggage. She gestured toward the cottage, toward the life she'd built. I won't say I forgive you because I don't know if that's true yet, but I will say this. Watching the sunrise from these hills every morning, holding my son, living free, that's its own kind of forgiveness. Not for you, for me. Inside, Thomas began singing one of the old palace songs Ilara still hummed without thinking, his young voice clear and unself-conscious. Alden closed his eyes as though the sound caused physical pain, his hands clenching and unclenching at his sides. When he opened them again, they were clear with acceptance. That's enough, he said. More than enough. More than I deserved. He stepped back from the gate, back toward the path that would take him down the hills and eventually north to whatever peace he might find in monastery walls. Be happy, Ilara. Both of you. That's all I'll ever ask. She watched him walk away, his figure gradually disappearing into the morning mist until he was nothing but a shadow. Then less than that. Then gone. In her hand, the wildflowers trembled slightly, and she brought them to her nose, breathing in their simple perfume. Behind her, Thomas emerged from the cottage fully dressed, his hair sticking up in ways that made her heart clench with love so fierce it bordered on pain. "Who was that man, Mama?" he asked, taking her hand with the casual confidence of a child who knows he's loved absolutely. Ilara looked down at her son, this impossible, precious boy who carried royal blood but would never wear a crown, who had his father's eyes but would forge his own path, and smiled. "Just a traveler," she said, using the same lie Alden had told her 7 years ago, transformed now into something closer to truth. Someone who lost his way and needed to see that some things turn out right despite everything. Thomas accepted this explanation with a child's easy faith and pulled her toward the garden, already chattering about helping old Martha and whether the goat needed more grain. As they walked, Ilara placed the wildflowers on the small shrine she'd built near her door. Not a religious shrine, but a place where she kept tokens of survival and transformation. And there, beneath the morning sun burning away the mist, she whispered words that were both prayer and release. To forgive is also to reign. Years later, villagers would speak of the gray-haired man who sometimes appeared on the hills at dawn, watching a stone cottage from a distance before disappearing like morning fog. They'd speak of the woman who'd built a life from nothing, who taught their children and healed their sick and sang songs so beautiful they made grown men weep. And they'd speak of the boy who grew into a man known throughout the region for his kindness, his wisdom, his strange golden eyes that seemed to see into people's souls and find the good there, even when they'd forgotten it existed. But none of them knew, or if they knew, they never spoke of, the story that connected them all. The tale of a king who learned to be human, and a woman who learned that survival could become something beautiful if you were brave enough to let it. Sometimes the heaviest chains we carry aren't made of iron. They're forged from the mistakes we've made and the forgiveness we've refused to grant. Ilara's story forces us to confront an uncomfortable truth, that the people who hurt us most deeply are often those struggling with their own cowardice, their own weakness, their own impossible choices. Would you have found the strength to rebuild after losing everything? Could you have looked into the eyes of the person who destroyed you and chosen something other than hate? And perhaps most challenging of all, if you were Alden, would you have had the courage to admit your failures publicly, knowing it would cost you everything you'd spent a lifetime building? This story reminds us that redemption isn't a single moment of confession or apology. It's 7 years of showing up. It's choosing truth when lies would be easier. It's understanding that some wounds scar over but never fully heal, and that's okay, because survival itself can be a form of victory. Forgiveness isn't about forgetting or excusing what was done. It's about refusing to let the past consume whatever future remains. To forgive is also to reign, not over others, but over the bitterness that would otherwise rule our hearts. If this story moved you, if it made you think about your own capacity for forgiveness or the weight of your own mistakes, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Leave a like to help others discover this journey of pain and redemption. And subscribe to follow more stories that don't just entertain, but challenge us to become better versions of ourselves. Because sometimes, the most powerful thing we can do is witness someone else's struggle and recognize our own humanity reflected back at us.